In 1984, a lawsuit brought against the 7 manufacturers of Agent Orange secured a $180 million settlement for Vietnam veterans exposed to the dangerous chemical. The companies, as military contractors, had immunity, but decided to settle out of court under the provision that they would not be considered liable. Monsanto paid 45% of that money. That $180 million, when doled out to approximately 52,000 qualified applicants who were either a totally disabled Vietnam veteran or the survivor of a deceased veteran, amounted to roughly $3,800 each. Approximately 3 million Vietnamese people had also been exposed to Agent Orange, at least 1 million of them and their future offspring suffering chronic illnesses and cancers that American veterans also developed. Meanwhile, the U.S. government didn't admit until 1979 that post-traumatic stress disorder existed 6 years after the last soldiers came home, where they received $200 a month in benefits, trimmed by the Reagan administration. In the years that followed, critically acclaimed films would fictionalize the psychological damage and human toll of the Vietnam War, like Full Metal Jacket, Platoon, and Born on the 4th of July. These 1980s films debuted during a time of intense patriotism via films like Top Gun and Rocky IV. When Reagan became president, he wished to recover America's reputation for successfully waging and fighting wars after the losses of Vietnam. In the Reagan New Day narrative, America was strong, patriotic, and manly again. America was doing well. It was healthy. But under the veneer of wellness was fear, trauma, mental illness, and hatred. These components would be media fodder for lucrative consumption in daytime talk shows and a bustling information machine that both catalyzed progress as well as hindered it. In the penultimate episode of Lexual Does the 80s, we'll be diving into the American body, mind, and media diet to get a better understanding of the American psyche.
Heard what you said. You just said I don't sit with monkeys. You think because she's black, because I'm black, we're monkeys?
That's a last-ditch effort when you call a mental health clinic.
Every decade brings new understandings in medical science and what ails humans, and the 80s was no different. In 1980, generalized anxiety disorder was introduced in the American Psychological Association's Manual of Mental Disorders. In 1981, the hepatitis B vaccine was approved. In 1982, the first synthesized human insulin was made available using DNA mapping that allowed insulin to be produced more quickly. As it was still under patent by Big Pharma, it would still mean expensive out-of-pocket care for the 5 to 6 million Americans with diabetes. However, improvements to living with diabetes were made when the first blood glucose monitors were introduced for home use. 1986 also saw the introduction of the insulin pen. The next year, the gene associated with inherited early onset Alzheimer's was identified, and in 1988, LASIK eye surgery premiered. But medical advancements were costly in our capitalist society, as was preventative care. During the decade, healthcare costs rose by an average of 9.9% each year. As the main employment opportunities available to Americans shifted from unionized and public sector jobs to service and retail labor in the private sector, it's no surprise that many people lost their employer-sponsored insurance, even if they worked full-time. From 1988 to 1991, 5% of Americans lost employer insurance, and by the early 90s, 18.7 million members of families headed by full-time, full-year workers were uninsured, up 18.1% from levels reported in 1988. A total of over 34 million Americans were uninsured after Reagan left office, many of them dealing with a plethora of physical and mental issues we're about to cover. 100,000 people died of HIV/AIDS between 1981 and 1990, largely thanks to a negligent government and a lack of information and healthcare access. Misinformation abounded. In 1984, media outlets including the New York Times reported that HIV was possibly spread by saliva, which turned out to be false. A year later, the LA Times reported more than half of the adults in the nation support quarantining AIDS patients. Nearly half would approve of ID cards for those who test positive for AIDS antibodies. More than a third would be willing to pay a 1-penny national sales tax to finance greater research, and 1 in 7 would favor such radical action as tattooing those with the disease, demonstrating the public fear and stigma of HIV and the public's cheapness. What's more, the same survey reported only 8% of the public believes that gays have too little political power. Another 39% said they believe the political power of gays is about right, and 34% said homosexuals have too much power. Reagan didn't publicly address HIV/AIDS until 1985, while activists took to extreme and brave measures to force people to pay attention and demand federal interference. A drug, AZT, hit the market in 1987, but was very expensive and ultimately ineffective. It was a rush job and very toxic to those who took it, but Anthony Fauci, head of the National Institute of Health, was trying to expand prescription of the drug. And while clumsy drugs, conspiracy theories, and fear-mongering flourished among a backdrop of death and illness, information pamphlets were not distributed until 1988. Please check out this Let's Talk About Sex History video, Stigma and STDs, for much more on HIV/AIDS in the 80s. Though the tragedy of AIDS dominated the decade, there were other illnesses, discoveries, and controversies in the medical world shaping experiences and discourse. In the late 80s, Epstein-Barr virus, which causes mononucleosis, or the kissing disease, was reported as being in over 90% of Americans and linked with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It wouldn't be until 2022 that the disease was linked to multiple sclerosis. Tampons saw controversy in 1980 when Relay's super-absorbing tampons, which could absorb up to 20 pounds their weight, were causing users to develop toxic shock syndrome. A toxic shock syndrome task force was established, and by September it was announced that Relay users were at an increased chance of TSS. By 1983, there were over 2,200 cases requiring hospitalization. Relay ultimately went under, and more research found that any brand of tampons that were too absorbent could cause TSS. After numerous children in Lyme, Connecticut were experiencing arthritis-like symptoms in the late 70s, a 1982 discovery found the bacterial connection between ticks on deer and what is now known as Lyme disease. Lyme had been around for centuries, but in the 80s, doctors were able to come up with antibiotic treatments for those suffering with Lyme. Much of the developments in understanding Lyme disease were because two mothers of the affected children were adamant about doing their own research and finding treatment after medical experts were dismissive. Being investigative about medical treatment and setting new expectations for mortality were abundant. In 1984, a 5-year-old named Lorenzo O'Donnell was diagnosed with adrenoleukodystrophy, or ALD, a fatal genetic condition that caused neurological deterioration. Doctors gave Lorenzo, who was in a vegetative state, approximately 2 years to live, which his parents, Michaela and Augusto, did not accept. Though they triggered the ear of numerous medical practitioners and support groups, the two parents researched and sought out a cure. They collaborated with a doctor and created Lorenzo's oil, which seemed to alleviate Lorenzo's symptoms. They also established an institute to further investigate ADL. Though the effectiveness of Lorenzo's oil as a cure would come into question, Lorenzo remained alive until 2008. While he remained in a near total body paralysis, Lorenzo did have the ability to move his fingers and eyebrows, allowing him to communicate with people around him. Speaking of people in vegetative states, the 1980s were a turning point in beliefs about euthanasia, or medically assisted killing, and quality of life. The decade started with the Vatican denouncing euthanasia, and in 1983, a 25-year-old named Nancy Cruzan was declared to be in a persistent vegetative state after a car accident in Carthage, Missouri. In her case, she was fully unresponsive, living in frequent pain, and was kept alive by a feeding tube. Detailed the New York Times, her body was rigid and her feet and hands contracted and bent. She had occasional seizures and vomited, and while her eyes sometimes opened and moved, she showed no signs of recognizing her family. In 1988, her parents asked the hospital to remove her feeding tube, which the hospital refused to do unless compelled by a court, because doing so would surely kill her. A friend testified that Nancy mentioned she would not wish to continue her life unless she could live at least halfway normally. Nancy's parents successfully got a court to rule that it is, quote, a fundamental natural right to refuse or direct the withholding or withdrawal of artificial life-prolonging procedures when the person has no more cognitive brain function and there is no hope of further recovery. Nancy's legal representation, as well as the state of Missouri, appealed this decision, propelling propelling the Right to Die movement into the spotlight. The National Right to Life Committee took a break picketing abortion clinics to fight for Nancy to live. The Supreme Court pondered whether or not the state of Missouri had the constitutional right to require clear and convincing evidence for Nancy to be removed from life support. In a 5-4 decision, the court ruled that the state could require a high threshold of proof that it was an incapacitated person's wishes to be removed from life support. So, the right to die was not guaranteed by the Constitution or the Supreme Court, leaving individual states to determine their own standards. Nancy's parents secured more evidence and her tube was eventually removed so she could die of natural causes. But what about people who were conscious and suffering from chronic pain or depression? The same year of Nancy's car accident, a 26-year-old quadriplegic woman suffering from severe cerebral palsy and arthritis checked herself into a Riverside, California psychiatric ward. The woman, Elizabeth Bouvier, was almost totally paralyzed and asked to be allowed to be starved to death as she wished to die by suicide. Her husband, a man she met in a pen pal program in prison, had married her after his release and wanted her to stay alive. He detailed the ways the world was unforgiving to her disabilities, like how her college advisor said, "If we had known your handicap was as severe as it is, we would have never placed you." He was talking about the special program for disabled people. This, among other indignities and inaccessible living, was making Elizabeth severely depressed. Riverside General Hospital refused to let her die and then ordered her to be force-fed. Elizabeth and the ACLU failed to stop the force feeding in a lawsuit. Consequently, she tried to resist force feeding by biting through her tube, so the hospital responded by restraining her while they force-fed her. Intense disagreements ensued on whether or not this constituted battery and torture. Elizabeth was also hooked up to morphine to ease her arthritis. In 1986, she appealed the court's decision to force-feed her. The court ruled that force-feeding was battery, but by this time, Elizabeth wanted to live because of the pain of dying by starvation. She made it clear, however, that she still wanted to die. The debate over the ethics of acquiescing to a terminally ill or a chronically in pain person's suicidal wishes was becoming evident. The Hemlock Society was founded in 1980 and provided info to the dying on the most painless and effective way to die, while also lobbying to legalize physician-assisted suicide. It had approximately 44,000 members and 78 chapters by the early 90s. In 1988, the Journal of the American Medical Association published an anonymously written essay called "It's Over, Debbie." The writer, a gynecology resident, claimed to have euthanized a woman with ovarian cancer by administering a shot of morphine. The essay was extremely controversial, especially because the person gave the poison after hearing the 20-year-old patient's only words, "Let's get this over with." Said one professor of medicine, "This could change medicine profoundly and irreversibly. It undermines the profession if the public believes that doctors have the power to kill people, and occasionally do." There was an investigation, but the essay and alleged victim remained anonymous. Christianity Today published a rebuttal titled "It's Not Over, Debbie." Another euthanasia advocate of the 80s was more upfront. Pathologist Jack Kevorkian was publishing articles on euthanasia and began advertising himself in 1987 in Detroit papers as a death counselor. He helped a 54-year-old woman named Janet Atkins, diagnosed with Alzheimer's, die in 1990, and the resulting legal battles would occur in the following decade, along with more assisted deaths of patients who were, quote, isolated, lonely, and potentially depressed. For many Americans, conversations about having the right to die and access to euthanasia was a slippery slope of ableism and eugenics. What gives someone the right to determine another human's quality of life? What is considered too much suffering? What gives someone the right to determine that another person should or should not live? And who can determine whether or not someone can't survive further? Who can determine whether or not a person can give up on life if they didn't want treatment? The answers to these questions were important for everyone, but especially the disabled. Disability, depending on the mental and physical conditions covered, affected 1/3 to 1/4 of the American population, and it was coming to be understood in new ways. In 1980, ABC, NBC, and PBS debuted closed captioning TV shows, the same year that Time magazine declared the deaf are no longer a silent majority. In the 80s, about 21.2 million Americans had impaired hearing, and a little under 1 million were completely deaf. Black deaf people were carving their own community as well, with the Eastern Regional Black Deaf Conference held by Howard University in 1981, and the establishment of the National Black Deaf Advocates, which grew nationwide. They were not getting their needs met by mostly white deaf organizations, which isn't surprising. In 1988, the only higher education institution for deaf students, Galludet University in Washington, D.C., was protested by its students for not having a deaf president.
The world got covered! board has chosen a hearing president, preventing deaf people from getting what they want. They want to bring deaf people down. When deaf people prepare to succeed, hearing people bring them down.
They're still afraid that deaf people can't do it. That's what I believe. They're afraid.
The week-long protest resulted in the appointment of Dr. I. King Jordan, a deaf man.
Deaf president King Jordan had been selected. There was excitement everywhere. Everyone was jumping up and down, shouting. Even the faculty and staff, even older people were jumping and shouting. We were thrilled. We couldn't believe it.
Said National Association for the Deaf member Anita Farb, deaf people no longer want to take a back seat. And with more deaf people being better educated, they're finding that they really can make a difference. Also, I can't help but to mention that Prince performed a free concert at Galludet University in 1984. Said one happy student, "I had a lot of fun. I felt his music. I couldn't hear the words, but I could feel the vibrations. Deaf people really appreciate and love loud music." All kinds of disabled people were sick of being infantilized and desired their own autonomy in spaces, as well as accessibility. In 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that colleges receiving federal funding must make reasonable modifications for qualified disabled individuals. ADAPT, a disability rights organization, protested for bus lifts nationwide. In 1986, the National Council on the Handicapped issued a report outlining the discrimination against disabled Americans and cited the need for federal legislation. Though the early 80s saw federal budget cuts to blindness programs, blind activists lobbied successfully in 1988 for Congress to authorize funding for described video. At the end of the decade came the passage of the American with Disabilities Act, which made discrimination against Americans with disabilities a crime. This was a major win in employment protections, building access, various aids for disabled people on location, and service animal handling. The main dissenters to this legislation were those who didn't want to make public accommodations inclusive, like the Association of Christian Schools International, as it meant they would have to make expensive changes to their buildings. And conservatives hated this legislation in general because the new oversight of this law meant an expanded government. And while federal law may have changed, changes in attitudes and steps to be more inclusive towards disabled people would be slow. In 1980, the American Psychological Association differentiated autism from childhood schizophrenia. 7 years later, the APA provided a checklist for diagnosing autism at the lower end of what will come to be called the spectrum. A UCLA psychologist also published a study showing that intensive behavior therapy could help autistic children. The next year, the highest grossing film at the box office was Rain Man, starring Dustin Hoffman as an autistic savant kidnapped by his brother. It was an awards show darling, though some people weren't impressed, like reviewer Pauline Kael, who wrote, "Rain Man is getting credit for treating autism authentically because Raymond isn't cured. In a simple transposition, it's his brother who's cured." Actually, autism here is a dramatic gimmick that gives an offbeat tone to a conventional buddy movie. It was publicized that for his role in Rain Man, Hoffman spent a year speaking to and researching autistic individuals like cattle rancher and inventor Temple Grandin and savant Kim Peek. Though the film was lauded by many for its humanizing of a neurodivergent individual, it made popular the misconception that everyone with autism had savant abilities, or that only those with savant abilities were okay. The film, as well as new advancements in diagnosing autism, inspired more money in research for autism and autism awareness, but also for potential autism cures, which are highly unwanted by many autistic people. The movie also coincided with a rise in prenatal screening for Down syndrome, which affects roughly 20% of autistic individuals. Prior to the 80s, most people with Down syndrome were put in institutions, but the National Association for Down Syndrome and other advocates fought for home care and programs to teach literacy and self-sufficiency. The availability of prenatal screening gave parents a new type of power that worried disability advocates: the power to decide what kind of life is valuable enough to bring into the world. Arguments about preventing autism and Down syndrome via fetal testing, conspiracies about origins and vaccines, and other contentious debates would follow in the 90s and beyond. In 1980, Jimmy Carter signed the Mental Health Systems Act into law, which gave grants to community mental health centers. Within a year of assuming office, Reagan repealed the act and cut federal mental health funding by a third. Over 40,000 beds in state mental hospitals were closed. John Hinckley Jr., who would be diagnosed as schizophrenic after shooting Ronald Reagan in 1981, was not the 40th president's only knowledge or personal connection to the dangers of untreated mental illness. Reagan's personal lawyer, Roy Miller, had two sons who were schizophrenic, schizophrenic. One died by suicide in 1981, and the other murdered and raped his own mother in 1983. As the governor of California, Reagan had continued a trend of deinstitutionalization, abolishing involuntary hospitalization except for in extreme cases. To be clear, the likelihood of receiving poor or abusive treatment in asylums and hospitals was well documented in the mid-20th century. Rather than reforming such hospitals to be beacons of treatment, which costs money and requires government oversight, again, Republicans hate big government, or so they say, unless it's about war. Anyways, hospitals were closed, removing mentally ill patients who could manage and function in society with a bit of care and resources was desired by advocates, but there were others who needed more supervision. So during the 1970s, California, which is typically the progressive legislative leader, sent more and more patients from hospitals into the lucrative board and care facilities, a bustling for-profit industry. Many board and care facilities were placed in struggling neighborhoods where there was crime and cheaply plentiful drugs. Treatment of the mentally ill in these facilities was not always much better than the quality of life at asylums. Many indigent or troubled mentally ill people were kicked out of facilities who didn't want to provide costly specialized care, and others left voluntarily. By the 80s, the demographics of the unhoused were shifting from single white men, typically older and alcoholics, to a wider variety, as I discuss in this video about homelessness. Said a New York City shelter director in 1984, "We're just getting loads of people. It's hard to figure out who they are. All we know is that they're younger and blacker." There are several reasons why homelessness grew. In New York, the number of adult mental hospital inmates between 1965 and 1981 went from 85,000 to 23,000, with an estimated 47,000 ending up on the streets of the city. At the same time, the Big Apple wanted to attract higher income residents who had been living in surrounding suburbs since the 40s, so it offered tax incentives to encourage owners of cheap rooming houses and single-room occupancy hotels to convert them to pricey condos and rental apartments. Roughly 60% of affordable single-room occupancy hotel rooms were gone by 1981. This happened in many cities. Affordable housing would steadily dry up as cost of living rose in the decades to come. In D.C., Mitch Snyder and other activists for the National Coalition for the Homeless and Community for Creative Nonviolence occupied an abandoned federal building, with Mitch also leading a 51-day hunger strike. The negative publicity forced the Reagan administration to lease the building to the Community for Creative Nonviolence for $1 a year, and it became the largest shelter in the city. The Coalition for the Homeless had been founded in 1981 by Robert Hayes, a lawyer who litigated a New York case establishing that all unhoused people had the right to emergency shelter. Within 3 years of this agreement, there were 18 city-run public shelters that were struggling to house the homeless population. And the main goal of homeless shelters was not to solve homelessness, but rather to slap a band-aid on it. Said the Deputy Administrator for the Human Resources Administration, "Our goals are very clear. Temporary shelter so no one freezes to death." Despite being warned about a prospective housing crisis in 1982, the Reagan administration stopped plans to build federally subsidized low-income housing, raised rent on such housing, and introduced cheap housing vouchers. And in true villain fashion, when the unhoused came up on the 1984 campaign trail, Reagan said, "The people who are sleeping on the grates, the homeless who are homeless, you might say, by choice." At the same rally, he insisted that the government was not greedy or infringing on the rights of the poor. Quipped the Washington Post, "The estimated $30,000 to $35,000 cost of the presidential trip here was paid by the government rather than the Reagan-Bush '84 campaign." 2 months later, Reagan commissioned a report on homelessness, which undercounted the unhoused at being around 250 to 350,000, a number which experts believe to be sitting at 500,000. The Village Voice extensively covered how the Reagan administration undercounted the homeless in a 1985 article. Until the mid-80s, what was missing from much discourse by homelessness activists as well as dicks like Reagan was the importance of mental health. Simply providing a job and a home were not enough when poor mental health, trauma, and drug use were a part of the equation. Rebecca Smith was a 61-year-old black former pianist and college valedictorian with a family actively trying to bring her home when she froze to death in a cardboard hut in January 1982. She had been diagnosed as a schizophrenic and hospitalized for 10 years, where she had been subject to electromagnetic therapy therapy, which did more damage to her mental state. Before her death, there were numerous attempts to move her to an unhoused shelter, and the city even sought a court order to forcibly remove her, but could not secure one in time. Mitch Snyder, the champion for unhoused people, died by suicide in 1990. In the 5 years prior, the mental health crisis as it pertained to homelessness was becoming more evident. Black men, women, children, and transgender youth were becoming more numerous on the streets, as well as the mentally ill. On October 28, 1987, the same year that Democrats successfully pushed the McKinney Act, which gave over $1 billion to homeless programs, a woman named Joyce Brown was involuntarily committed to Bellevue Hospital under Project Help, Mayor Ed Koch's new initiative to remove erratic behaving mentally ill people from the streets using doctors and nurses in vans. Koch said, if the crazies want to sue me, they have every right to sue, and by crazies, I'm talking about those who say, no, you have no right to intervene to help. Declaring, I'm not insane, just unhoused, the former Secretary Joyce Brown, who had been diagnosed as psychotic, also had a drug addiction. Her 4 sisters had been looking for her and trying to get her to come back home. In addition to yelling insults to people, especially black men, she was a frequent traffic hazard who referred to herself as Billie Boggs, a local TV personality. While committed, Joyce secured representation by the Civil Liberties Union, who contested Koch's program. Joyce was released after 11 weeks and immediately was asked to speak at Harvard University on homelessness, identifying as a political prisoner. Reported the New York Times, not too long ago, Joyce Brown lived on an Upper East Side sidewalk in front of a restaurant's hot air vent. She hurled insults at some passersby, made friends with others, and used the street for her bathroom. But in a little more than 3 months, Ms. Brown, 40 years old, has been transformed from an anonymous street person into something of a media star. She has dined at Windows on the World and compiled a list of favorite restaurants. She has shopped at Bloomingdale's, Saks Fifth Avenue, and Lord & Taylor. She was interviewed on national and local television and received half a dozen movie and book offers. The case was seen by conservatives as a woman winning the right to be homeless, and for liberals, a win for bodily autonomy. Unfortunately, Brown's poor mental episodes continued, as well as her heroin use, and the newfound spotlight probably didn't help matters. New York Magazine found her on the streets, back to her erratic behavior within 3 weeks of her Harvard speech. Eventually, she was moved into a long-term supervised residence for the mentally ill, and the movie and book offers never came to fruition. In July 1988, the city of New York's homelessness problem was further made televised when Mayor Ed Koch imposed a 1 a.m. curfew on Tompkins Square Park, which had become crowded with homeless people in tents. Many neighborhood residents, as well as the homeless, protested against the curfew in August. Police charged the 200 to 300 protesters and beat people up, causing 35 injuries while they yelled racist slurs. Multiple moments of police attacking defenseless, unhoused people were caught on camera, bringing many members of the community together. Recalled a witness, the streets were full of people who I see coming out of their houses every morning with briefcases. I mean, people who work on Wall Street, and they're standing in the street screaming, kill the pigs. The curfew was revoked as police brutality complaints swelled. The capture of brutality on home video was still very novel.
At first, city officials were not very sympathetic to cries of police brutality during the Sunday morning riot in Tompkins Square Park. But that has changed now that the mayor and police commissioner have seen some home videos of what happened. Dave Browdy reports.
There is a substantial difference between what top city officials are saying tonight about the riot near Tompkins Square Park and what they said yesterday.
There is some behavior that was captured on tape that I think the individual officers that are involved are going to have some great difficulty explaining why they were using the amount of force that they were using at that particular time against the person that they did. Now,
yesterday, the police commissioner had said he saw nothing that indicated police overreacted in dealing with demonstrators at the park Saturday night. But for the past 48 hours, video has been surfacing like this sequence, in which the police approach a demonstrator and begin first berating him, then beating and chasing him. Then the police turn on the photographer, whom they see capturing their actions on videotape.
All right, I'm getting down.
Only 2 cops would be charged with the use of excessive force, and only 1 would be fired, a woman. Nationwide, involuntary hospitalization and medical treatment continued to become illegal since the 70s, and mentally ill, unhoused people in dire need of treatment often continued self-medicating, making them prime targets of harassment, street violence, and arrests by the police. Summed up a psychiatrist, police regard arrest and booking into jail as a more reliable way of securing involuntary detention of mentally disordered persons. So, plenty of mentally ill people were given freedom and autonomy when turned out on the streets for from mental hospitals, where they could not be compelled to take prescribed medicine, only to be re-detained in jail cells after a lack of the treatment they needed. The proportion of prison inmates with untreated mental illness would only grow, while the overall prison population grew from roughly 330,000 prisoners in 1980 to 771,000 by the decade's end.
Which of us will strike out against our families, neighbors, strangers, or politicians? That no one can tell in advance. And no one in our country seriously thinks that anyone who is different, who excites suspicion from neighbors or even the police, should be detained or treated against his will.
The 1980s mental illness conversation becomes more complicated when addressing the kinds of crimes and harm that were being linked to the neglect of disorders, especially schizophrenia, manic depression, and PTSD. The decade started with the murder of John Lennon in New York by a disturbed fan named Mark David Chapman. Years later, he would blame his wife, who he is still married to, saying she didn't go to somebody, even the police, and say, "Look, my husband's bought a gun and he says he's gonna kill John Lennon." Chapman had multiple past suicide attempts and had been admitted to a hospital for heavy depression and was a heavy drinker. PTSD and depression were especially pertinent in the 1984 case of Tyrone Mitchell, a 28-year-old who had been 22 years old when his 5 younger siblings and both his parents were murdered and or died by suicide during the Jonestown massacre at the hands of notorious cult leader Jim Jones. Mitchell suffered a nervous breakdown and began using PCP, with his behavior becoming increasingly erratic. In the 6 years after the Jonestown massacre, he discharged weapons and harassed neighbors with no help or consequences. On February 24, 1984, he shot and killed 2 people at a Los Angeles elementary school and injured 12 others, mostly children, before dying by suicide. He was legally sober at the time. Sadly, that was not the last school shooting of the decade. A man named Patrick Purdy killed 5 people and injured 32 others, mostly Southeast Asian immigrants at Cleveland Elementary in Stockton, California in 1989.
Journalists from around the nation crowded near a Stockton police captain today as he revealed new details about yesterday's unexplainable massacre. It turns out this killing field was once Purdy's own playground. He attended Cleveland Elementary School from kindergarten through 3rd grade and once lived on American Avenue nearby.
Much was made about Purdy being an alcoholic, cocaine addict, and mentally disturbed. Michael Jackson would visit the school in the weeks that followed in a flurry of news reporting.
The killing machine was this AK-47 with bayonet. Carved into the barrel was the word Hezbollah, the name of an Iranian terrorist group. There were also the words freedom and victory. On ammo clips were other slogans, including evil and humanoids.
As a result, California enacted a ban on assault rifles that didn't serve a sporting purpose. This teeny bit of legislation would be the exception nationwide, not the rule, and would be ensnared in arguments about gun control in the future. It's hard to not wonder if some lives could have been saved 5 years earlier when 41-year-old James Huberty, a conspiracy theorist and survivalist, fatally shot 21 people and injured 19 others at a San Isidro McDonald's in San Diego.
These images are more of war than of a small fast food restaurant in San Isidro. Yet it was a local man dressed in battle fatigues who declared, "I have killed 1,000, I'm gonna kill 1,000 more." 41-year-old James Huberty reportedly walked into the restaurant carrying a semi-automatic rifle and 2 other weapons, enough ammunition to last 2 hours. Witnesses inside said he fired wildly into the unsuspecting crowd gathered for a quick evening meal. He fired through windows, hitting people in the street. He fired at men, women, children, and babies.
Huberty's weapons included a shotgun, a pistol, and an Uzi. For years, Huberty had been abusive to his family and freaked acquaintances out with his obsession with guns. A week before his killing spree, he lost his job. 3 days before, he tried obtaining an appointment at a San Diego mental health clinic, but didn't get a return phone call.
Mr. Huberty called the clinic and was asked a series of 5 questions, which are typical screening questions, and answered all those questions in the negative and did not want to speak about his problem, and was told that he would be called back for an appointment within a day or 2, and that was the nature of the telephone conversation, which happened, of course, the day before the event.
I think the mental health clinic should consider, if a person takes the time to call a mental health clinic, they definitely have a problem. I mean, most people, there's a stigma connected to calling for mental help. That's a last-ditch effort when you call a mental health clinic.
Most of the victims in the McDonald's were Mexican American. Huberty's wife, who would later ludicrously sue McDonald's and James's former employer, claimed that he wasn't a racist, but a Nazi. She said he thought he was German, but he wasn't. He acted like he was German. Worsening the tragedy, within 2 days, McDonald's was preparing to reopen the location right after employee funerals, which prompted over 1,000 local and 30,000 global signatures on a petition to close the location and open a memorial park. Disgustingly, tourists were arriving from as far away as DC and London to pose for pictures in front of the restaurant. McDonald's agreed to tear down the building, which was replaced by a memorial. James Huberty, who was shot and killed by a sniper rifle 77 minutes into his rampage, had suffered a mental breakdown before. The previous winter, he told a police officer he was a war criminal. Instead of being assessed and taken to a mental hospital, he was interviewed at a federal building at the Tijuana border, found to have no military service whatsoever, and then set free. Recalled a co-worker of his growing delusions, he talked about the end of the world. He and his family were going to be the only ones left. He talked about going off into the woods. Huberty, in the 2 years before the massacre, was in a perpetual downward financial spiral and lost his job. These are not excuses, but still an important reminder of the connections between economic insecurity and violence in a capitalist society. And what about the main arena of capitalism, the workplace?
Good evening. Here's what's happening. At first, everybody thought it was a joke. Somebody setting off firecrackers in the post office at Edmond, Oklahoma, outside Oklahoma City. But soon it became clear that it wasn't a joke at all. It was a massacre.
The 1986 Edmond post office shooting in Oklahoma embodied the most extreme convergence of poor mental health and poor working conditions in a country with easy gun access. After Marine veteran Patrick Sherrill killed 14 people, including one of 2 supervisors who had reprimanded him the day before, the term going postal was coined. The event sparked discourse about the state of the United States postal system, which had recently been drained of federal money and was alleged to be overworking its employees. A 1989 postal shooting in Escondido, California, further gave legs to the idea of going postal, and more post office shootings would follow in the 90s. In 1989 in Louisville, Kentucky, a man who had been seeking psychiatric treatment since the late 70s, named Joseph T. Westbecker, killed 8 people and injured 12 others at his former place of employment while on Prozac, which his family would claim contributed to his behavior. In 1984, 5 years before he took Prozac, Westbecker's medical records showed that he had attempted suicide 12 to 15 times, as well as confessed to a psychiatrist that he thought about harming his job foreman. Prozac at the time of the shooting was being touted as a miracle happy pill that would balance depression and anxiety. In 1987, the same year that the nation was fighting a costly war against predominantly black users of street drugs, the popular, mainly white, mainly middle-class antidepressant was approved by the FDA. Sales of Prozac were $350 million within a year, and arguments about the drug's side effects like suicidal ideation and dependence would follow. Existing alongside all of the fun parts of the 1980s was an underlying loss and trauma at the 100,000 deaths caused by HIV/AIDS, the hundreds of thousands who went to prison in the war on drugs, the thousands murdered in gang wars and drug busts, the realities and fantasies of the satanic panic, perceived threats to the American family, fear of racist, homophobic, or misogynistic violence, economic insecurity, environmental disasters, and paranoia about the threat of nuclear war. You know, all the stuff we've been addressing during this series. Don't you love when shit comes together? Of course, these issues were magnified by the unprecedented availability of news and information. But first, in times of fear, calamity, mental strain, and death, there always seems to be ample room for hatred too.
Every time you want to get on race, you want to get on black. We're not racist just against black. We believe in races for your own race.
The decade started with various racial atrocities mentioned in past episodes of this series, but now it's time to go deeper beneath the surface. In 1979, Vietnamese refugees in the Galveston Bay area of Texas were taking up shrimp boating in large numbers, as well as being employed by local crab factories. A rise in overall fishing meant a reduced catch, and more imports meant low selling prices. Whites in the area were predictably pissed and started harassing the Vietnamese and being racist. racist. In August, a fistfight broke out between whites and Vietnamese that culminated in the self-defense shooting of a white crabber. The crabber's father told a local paper, "As long as there's one slur left in a fishing town in this Gulf Coast, there's gonna be trouble. There's gonna be war." Vietnamese boats were set on fire from 1979 to 1981, and a crab plant that hired many Vietnamese refugees was bombed. Hearing about the struggles of their disenfranchised white brethren, the Texas Knights of the KKK descended upon the area to further agitate the issue. On Valentine's Day 1981, white fishermen held a rally with support from the Grand Wizards of the Texas KKK, Louis Beam. In addition to leading the Klan, Beam was a Vietnam veteran, author of 1983's Essays of a Klansman, and leader of the Texas Emergency Reserve, an armed militia whose members also showed up in Galveston. Beam told the roughly 350 assembled white fishermen that he would give the Texas government until May 15, the start of shrimping season, to get rid of the Vietnamese who were stealing white jobs. Killing time until the deadline, at which the government did not comply, the racists burned an effigy and held a fish fry, symbolically continuing the Klan tradition of killing or terrorizing and eating while doing so. The Vietnamese fishermen in the Southern Poverty Law Center filed a suit against Beam's branch of the KKK, which led to a judicial order disbanding the group and shutting down his 5 training camps.
Tonight, the local Ku Klux Klan staged a rally in Santa Fe just off Highway 6, with the idea being to raise some money for a legal defense fund. That money going to defend some local Klansmen named in a suit by Vietnamese fishermen.
The suit claims harassment and threats by Klansmen and some American fishermen against Vietnamese refugee fishermen using Galveston Bay.
I hate to disappoint everybody, but I don't hate Vietnamese. I fought for them in Vietnam, shed my blood, sweat, and tears for their freedom, and since they've been here, I've worked with former Vietnamese veterans in projects of mutual interest and concern.
While the Vietnamese won the right to stay and shrimp on Galveston's shores, the aspects of Beam's racist spectacle, white victimhood, and populist sentiment would continue to impact the far right and broader, more moderate politics on the American landscape. Beam would pop up for attempted terrorist plots and participation in the Aryan nations for the rest of the decade. In 1984, he also started the Aryan Liberty Net, a pre-internet computer network linking Idaho, Texas, North Carolina, and Chicago. On the network, he emphasized leaderless resistance or lone wolf crimes. These groups and people like Beam were becoming increasingly paramilitary in nature. In 1981, several KKK and white supremacist group members developed Operation Red Dog, a highly convoluted plot to overthrow the government of Dominica, a Caribbean island. Dominica had suffered through a bad hurricane that year, and much of the population was poor and unhoused. For 2 years, the white supremacists stockpiled weapons and recruited mercenaries, thinking they could waltz in and install former Barbados revolutionary Patrick John into power. What did Patrick John believe he had to gain from this group of white supremacists? Drug and sex trafficking revenue and maybe some legitimate tourism or logging. On the morning of April 27th in New Orleans, as the group of 10 men set to take sail with their weapons and racist flags, they were arrested. The media called the failed invasion the Bayou of Pigs. Patrick John was shipped off to Barbados and jailed for treason. Meanwhile, all of the American wannabe mercenaries, including Don Black, were sentenced to federal prison for 3 years for violating the Neutrality Act. While serving out his sentence, Don Black took computer programming classes that would help him start hate website Stormfront years later. The KKK, Don Black's original bread and butter, was definitely no longer the frightening, powerful entity it was earlier in the 20th century, but it was rebranding itself and splintering into more perniciously dangerous factions. At the start of the decade, official dues-paying membership was at least 12,000 strong. Branches in states like the aforementioned Texas set up paramilitary training camps, offered to assist the INS in patrolling the U.S.-Mexico border for undocumented people, held rallies nationwide, and some members even won party nominations in California and Michigan. An undercover journalist, J.W. Thompson, completed a months-long expose in which he found that the Klan privately enjoyed financial support from prominent individuals and local communities. At the dawn of the 80s, the Klan was also aggressively pursuing white children between the ages of 10 and 17 through the Klan Youth Corps. Children were estimated to make up 10% of Klan numbers, and leaders were changing their tactics of engaging children, with one telling a newspaper, "Now we make the meetings fun. They're 90% play, 10% business. We see the Youth Corps as an alternative to the Boy Scouts, and the children recruit each other. In schools with racial problems, a Klansman will go to the school grounds and pass out literature. What kind of literature? Pamphlets asked, have you had it with blacks following you home to beat you up or holding your lunch money for you? Are you really uptight because white girls have to submit to being molested by crowds of grinning black thugs? These clearly capitalize on familiar racist tropes, but with a teenage spin. Interested youth were directed to mail at least $6 to headquarters with their application. The National Education Association warned about Klan recruitment of children at its 1981 convention and put money into training, informing, and assisting teachers to combat this. Some state school districts became directly involved, reported one New Jersey newspaper after a rise in racist harassment. To combat a rising tide of racial incidents and increasing efforts by the Ku Klux Klan to reach out to youngsters, New Jersey school children will be studying the Klan's history and tactics this year. While the Klan continued its growth tactics in an increasingly diverse America, other groups of white supremacists were refining their arguments and justifications in new groups who had more mainstream appeal because they didn't evoke images of backwater rednecks. Former KKK leader David Duke left the Klan in 1979 to start the National Association for the Advancement of White People, which was presented as a much more palatable form of white supremacist politic. So much so that it was referred to as the Klan without robes. Playing up the white man's status as perpetual victim at the hands of intrusive foreigners and no good blacks, the NAAWP published newspapers throughout the decade to an annual audience of roughly 18,000. The newspaper published articles about the black population bomb and was otherwise blatantly racist and anti-Semitic. David Duke himself would briefly fall out of the mainstream spotlight for the majority of the decade until he randomly popped up in 1989 and entered a special runoff election for the Louisiana House as a Republican. Duke claimed to be a changed man, no longer identifying with his past Nazism and racism, despite the 1980s news editorials. Duke's opponent, Republican John Treen, had support from George Bush and Ronald Reagan, but he was also in favor of higher property taxes, a fact that Duke exploited. It also helped matters that Duke expressed many of the racist fears that white Louisianans and Republicans in general worried about. Reported one paper, Republican leaders who endorsed Mr. Treen said they shared many of Mr. Duke's views on affirmative action, crime, and taxes, but said his election would send the wrong signal. Another paper interviewed Louisianans and noted an interesting and telling exchange between two friends. When both were asked of their support of Duke, one said, "I don't like John Treen, and I don't like niggers." The other winced at the racial slur and said he did not see Mr. Duke's campaign as being anti-black. Are you for real? For real. David Duke won with 50.7% of the vote and immediately turned his attention to bigger pastures. David Duke was hated by several of his cohorts like Tom Metzger, who claimed that while in the KKK, Duke slept with other Klans members' wives, saying his flagrant womanizing was an embarrassment to the movement. In the 70s and early 80s, other white supremacists weren't comfortable with Duke's adoration of Hitler and the Third Reich, claiming that as patriotic Americans, some with World War II veteran family members, that Duke was nothing but a Nazi. When Duke left the Klan in 1979, he claimed it was because the group was too violent, but high-ranking KKK members reported that he fell out of favor because of his links to Nazism. As the 80s wore on, though, more far-right Americans would lean into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. A core component of this was the rise of computer networks, the precursors to chat rooms, forums, blogs, and social media sites. Aryan Nations, White Aryan Resistance, and other hate groups had computer networks by 1985, and that year the New York Times reported that such sites were keeping enemy databases. It was also on these networks that a variety of new perspectives were introduced to lonely, miseducated, and/or outright hateful souls. Reported in an American Defense League report on computer hate networks, it does offer extremists a trendy way to spread hate propaganda, but there is little to suggest that this represents a great leap forward in the spread of anti-Semitic and racist propaganda. That skepticism today is laughable. In newspapers like David Duke's and in computer networks, white supremacists were being exposed to a new and quickly formalizing Holocaust denial movement. The 1976 book, The Hoax of the 20th Century, The Case Against the Presumed Extermination of European Jewry, made a quiet splash in right-wing extremist circles when it was published by Arthur Butts, an electrical engineering professor at Northwestern University. In 1979, the Institute for Historical Review was founded by a group of anti-Semites, and they started publishing the Journal of Historical Review in 1980. The IHR obtained the mailing list of the legitimate scholarly organization of American historians and mailed out its journal to the 12,000 members. The OAS said it was duped into giving the Quack Institute the mailing list, but it was too late. 12,000 people had access to this new, fake information. In addition to calling Anne Frank diaries a hoax and posing the popular denialist theory that any dead Jewish people were regular prisoners of war or starvation victims, not targets of systemic genocide, the journal promised a $50,000 reward to anyone who could prove that Jews were systemically gassed at Auschwitz. A Holocaust survivor and historical preservationist named Mel Mermelstein offered proof, and the IHR refused to pay. Mermelstein launched a lawsuit seeking $17 million in damages. Eventually, a ruling judge would compel IHR to pay Mermelstein $50,000 and issue an apology letter, also ruling the Holocaust as indisputable historic fact. In 1989, a Holocaust denier named Jean-Claude Brissac published an objective and extensive 564-page study of Auschwitz, concluding that the Germans, in fact, had acted to systemically exterminate the Jews in genocide. This is indisputable fact. If you're watching this video and you disagree, get the fuck out of here now. Even as more historical scholarship offering proof emerged and the Holocaust Memorial Museum was approved and built in DC in the 80s, Holocaust denial continued and actually grew in the decade alongside anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of a Zionist-occupied American government. Many young white Nazis adopted the look of skinheads, a subculture that originated in London and was an expression of alternative values, but not racism. Non-racist skinheads, especially black and Latino ones, were pissed that they were mixed up with the racist ones. Described the Washington Post, symbols are important. Hairstyle, tattoos, leather and chains, Doc Marten boots, makeup. In the Northeast, white shoelaces indicate a white power skin. Yellow laces denote Asian bashers. Pink laces, gay bashers. Black shoelaces, however, mean that the wearer is anti-racist. Media reports didn't often make the distinction between white power skinheads and non-racist ones. In 1983, Thomas Metzger, a former KKK Grand Wizard who you recall referred to David Duke as too much of a Nazi, established white Aryan resistance. His anti-Semitic views were mounting, and in 1985, Metzger alleged that the Nation of Islam invited him to attend a rally at which Louis Farrakhan was speaking. The Nation of Islam didn't confirm this, but Metzger and other members of war did attend. Metzger would tell the press that he believed that blacks and whites had the same enemy, Jews, elaborating, "We see similarities in the principles that Louis Farrakhan is talking about. The exploitation of working people by an elitist group in Washington and by corporations and by the people who are their sponsors and masters." Metzger bragged about dropping $100 in the Nation of Islam coffers, to which an NOI spokesman remarked, "I don't think that when you give $100, you form an alliance," confirming that money was given, but not that there was any such alliance. That same spokesman did, however, acknowledge that Metzger had given information about potential threats of violence from Jewish groups like the Jewish Defense League, who we'll come back to in a moment. So Metzger started a public access TV show named Race and Reason from San Diego, and by 1988 it was bringing in over $100,000 a year. It was sponsored in various cities by men like one Corvallis, Oregon resident who sent Hitler-themed birthday cards to Jewish residents. Metzger was tapping into a hateful contingent of white America unsatisfied with mainstream news. He said, 3 years ago when cable was getting off the ground, I realized that public access channels were perfect for views like mine that were having trouble getting expressed. These views included the Northwest Territorial Imperative, a belief that white Americans should leave multicultural areas for the Pacific Northwest, which had long been hostile to minorities. According to white supremacist Robert E. Miles, Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming had 493,782 square miles and less than 10 million total people, making it appealing to whites like himself. As documented by Kathleen Belew in Bring the War Home, the White Power Movement and Paramilitary America, Miles preached that the racial revolution would be fought not with guns, not with violence, but with love for each other. We will flood the Northwest with white babies and white children, so there is no question who this land belongs to. We are going to outbreed each other. With thoughts like these, it's no wonder white supremacists were so often entangled with the anti-abortion violence we addressed during the last episode. Other white leaders to endorse forms of the NWI, in which specific sections of the country were carved out specifically for whites, included David Duke and Tompkins Thomas Metzger. Others, inspired by the Turner Diaries, a 1978 novel about a white supremacist revolution, nuclear war, and race war, proposed resettlements in California. The 1986 Aryan Nations Congress, attended by over 4,000 racists in Idaho, was dedicated to promoting the Northwest Territorial Imperative. One of the assembly squabbles was over the display of Nazi and Klan regalia. Recalled one white supremacist who likely thought of himself as one of the good ones, "We have to reach beyond the run-of-the-mill jerk who's happy just to vote conservative every 4 years. But dressing up in sheets and yelling Hail Hitler is just stupid. It just turns people off." Fellow delegates heartily disagreed with this same speaker when he claimed that white Jews should be allowed into the Northwest Haven. A bunch of supremacists did move to the Pacific Northwest by the end of the 80s, including Louis Beam, who moved to the Aryan Nations compound in Hayden Lake, Idaho, and one Randy Weaver, who moved to Idaho with his family and began planning for the end of the world near a location called Ruby Ridge. Many of the supremacists most interested in the Northwest Territory were also enamored with ideas of the end of days and/or a distrust in federal government believed to be infiltrated by Jews. They were always armed, had overlapping membership in various hate groups, and they were usually Christian identity extremists. Christian identity is an extremist interpretation of Christianity that believes only white people are the actual descendants of the Israelites in the Bible, and that non-whites should be systemically exterminated or enslaved. In 1984, a Jewish radio host named Alan Berg in Denver, Colorado, who challenged Christian identity and white supremacist ideals, was assassinated by the Christian identity group The Order. The Order was founded in 1983 by Robert J. Matthews in Medellin, Washington, and it was partly inspired by the Turner Diaries and wanted a revolution against the American government, which it saw as being under Jewish control or Zionist-occupied government. The group funded its activities with armored car heists, which netted them $4.1 million, only 10% of which was ever recovered by law enforcement, and by the time of Alan Berg's murder, the group met its downfall when trying to pass off shitty counterfeits, bringing on RICO charges. Only 2 of the 4 guilty Order members who killed Alan Berg were convicted of the crime of violating his civil rights, but none for murder. Meanwhile, the Jewish Defense League, a fringe far-right group that had been around since 1968, continued its terrorist activities into the 80s. From 1980 to 85, there were 18 terrorist attacks by Jews on Soviet diplomats, Arab Americans, and neo-Nazis, and 15 were members of the Jewish Defense League, a small group of Zionists who desired to protect Jews from anti-Semitism by whatever means necessary. For example, in 81, 8 JDL members beat up Nazi Harold Covington with steel pipes, to which he would later say on TV, "All Jews should be gassed." But what constituted anti-Semitism? Disagreeing with Israel's so-called right to exist, or identifying with Palestinians? Counted. The JDL was denounced by mainstream Jewish organizations, but the violence directed at Arab Americans exacerbated already fragile discourse surrounding the Israeli occupation of Palestine and the treatment of its citizens, which we'll be coming back to in the next episode of this series. The 1985 bombing murder of Alex O'Day, a Palestinian activist, led to failed criminal convictions of Jewish Defense League group members and negative press, and the fleeing group would largely be under the radar before randomly resurfacing in 1990s hip-hop. Alex O'Day's killers would wind up in Israel, safe and sound. The random 1988 murder of an Ethiopian man named Mulugeta Sarah in Oregon by 3 war-affiliated members bankrupted the group. It was the type of leaderless resistance, aka terrorism, that white supremacists like Louis Beam were calling for. 2 of the 3 murderers would be released. Tom Metzger, who called the killing a civic duty, was ordered to pay $12.5 million to the family of Mulugeta Sarah. Unsurprisingly, Sarah's family only got a cheap house and a few $1,000s in 1990, while Metzger rode out the 80s operating war clandestinely and still promoting his views. In 1989, he held what he called Aryan Woodstock. A judge ruled that the event couldn't have music without a warrant, which went ungranted. Said one article, a concert billed as an Aryan Woodstock for skinheads and white supremacists turned out to be boring and uncomfortable because of rain, a lack of food, and a court-ordered ban on music. About 100 people representing half a dozen white supremacist groups gathered Saturday, but were far outnumbered by about 400 protesters and 500 police officers. Morale hit bottom when police refused to let the daughter of white supremacist Tom Metzger return with $100 worth of pizzas. So basically, they were sitting out there hungry, wet, bored, and hating. To close out the decade of mounting hatred on the radical right, William L. Pierce, author of the Turner Diaries, published Hunter. The book's main character, a serial killer of interracial couples, was based on Joseph Paul Franklin, a Klan member and Nazi drifter who was arrested in 1980 and linked to over 20 killings, many of the victims being black men, black boys, and white women. Wrote Pierce of the serial killer Franklin almost lovingly. He saw his duty as a white man and did what a responsible son of his race must do. Shortly before airing Woodstock and the release of Hunter, John Metzger, Tom's son, appeared on an episode of Geraldo which would go down in infamy and come to symbolize the lows of the American media diet.
And to scare minority people. Do you endorse that activity?
Listen, let's get to the real issues here.
Yes, sir,
why are you
John.
curbing? Why are you beating around the bush, Jerry? Look at Jerry King. That was your former name, wasn't it?
It wasn't, and I really recommend that you don't push me too hard.
Sucking up, trying to be a white.
Go ahead, Roy. Go ahead.
No, let me tell you. Hey, you gotta be kidding. You gotta be kidding. You gotta be kidding. Hey, hold it. Hold it.
Sit down.
Only slightly the worse for the wear. We're back.
Phil Donahue had been hosting Donahue since 1967, and it was billed as homemaker entertainment, popularizing the audience Q&A format and dealing with wide-ranging topics from sexuality to drug use to feminism. It continued to be the most popular talk show into the 80s until Oprah. In 1984, Oprah Winfrey's low-rated 30-minute AM talk show became the highest-rated talk show in Chicago. Oprah signed a syndication deal, and the Oprah Winfrey Show debuted nationally on September 8, 1986. While the show would later come to be characterized by Oprah's self-help journey, philanthropic causes, and book club, the early years were just about as questionable as other forms of television called trash TV. She held shows on women having babies with their fathers, the Satanic Panic, and cheaters.
Oprah's Coming Home, Baltimore, starting September 8th, only on Channel 2.
Sexy clothes tomorrow on the Oprah Winfrey Show. All right, we'll come back and we're going to talk about sex some more. Back in a moment. You know, there are thousands of men and women who are secretly worshiping the devil in this country. If you'd like to join that audience on Thursday when we discuss Satanism, call now to reserve your seat. The number is 750-7470.
In the early 80s, TV stations wanted bigger audiences and cheaper forms of public affairs programming, especially thanks to the rising competition from cable channels like Fox, Lifetime, and USA. By the end of the decade, over 60% of TV owners had cable. So for TV stations, cheap and spicy talk shows with taboo topics and questionable guests were the most profitable option. As the number of talk shows increased, topics became wilder and more salacious. Talk shows became more about splashy tabloid journalism regarding sex, drugs, poverty, despair, and cheating, while also exploiting divisive issues like hate or little understood issues like teen Satanism. The titans of the talk show landscape also included Sally Raphael, who debuted in 1983, and Morton Downey Jr., a confrontational host and anti-abortionist who debuted in 1987, the same year that the FCC waived the Fairness Doctrine, requiring television stations to provide an equal amount of left-leaning and right-leaning programming. Said the FCC commissioner, "We let the marketplace decide whether it's in good taste or bad taste." This hands-off government approach to television content is glazed over by Reagan-loving social conservatives who complained about the programming available on TV.
What's really going on in our high schools right now? Geography, sex, drugs, rock and roll.
Morton liked yelling, blowing smoke in people's faces, and getting guests to turn up on each other, like the skirmish between Roy Ennis and Al Sharpton I brought up in the last episode. His was the most extreme version of talk show television, but the novelty wore off. By 1989, Morton had lost his late night slot to newcomer Arsenio Hall.
You have a lot of critics who criticize you, calling it talk wrestling, and calling it TV trash. How do you respond to those people?
I respond very simply. Take a look at the issues that I discuss on my show. They concern the pocketbook. They concern the lifestyle of people. I almost never do a show on sex. There's plenty of sex out there. I don't need to do it. Oprah, Phil.
In April of that year, Morton, who was Jewish, claimed to be the victim of a neo-Nazi attack at the San Francisco International Airport. Numerous inconsistencies in Morton's story led to revelations that the story was a hoax to generate attention for his faltering show, which was canceled within 3 months. But talk shows that didn't go as far as Morton, who once slapped a guest, found more sustainable success. Geraldo, whose failed search of Al Capone's vaults generated big ratings and got him his own talk show, was very successful. His topics tended to veer towards the serious, and despite sensationalizing the satanic panic and other phenomena, he covered important stuff like sexual harassment in the Navy. It probably had something to do with the mustache, but his fan base was large and varied, including a black woman and retired Brooklyn nurse named Viola Naismith, who attended over 1,000 tapings of the show by the 1990s.
This, of course, is Viola. Viola, as you may know, has been to over 800 tapings of the Geraldo show, and I noticed you getting a little angry there. Well, first let me get a little kiss there. So what do you think about what you've heard?
During the episode in which Geraldo Rivera's nose was broken, the producers had snagged teen non-racist skinheads, white supremacists including John Metzger, and conservative civil rights activist Roy Ennis. The spectacle was a ratings goldmine and was one of many talk show specials featuring young and not so young hate mongers. They notably even appeared on Oprah.
I just heard what you said. You just said, I don't sit with monkeys. You think because she's black, because I'm black, we're monkeys? Is that?
That's a proven fact.
That's a proven fact? It's a proven fact that I'm a monkey?
Could be. But,
Go ahead.
First thing I want to get off my mind is...
I want to talk about this monkey stuff.
These skinheads... The ADL, okay?
No. I want to talk about the monkey business. I want to talk to monkey...
The spectacle of dominative racists on talk shows counteracted clandestine examples of racism and microaggressions, giving the ability for the mildly or not so mildly racist housewife to sit in Oprah or Geraldo's audience, for example, and feel relief that she is not one of the monsters on stage. Also, as detailed in Laura Grindstaff's book, The Money Shot, Trash Class and the Making of TV Talk Shows, producers very intently sought divisive topics and manipulated guests, even if they were very clearly mentally ill. While TV and print news publicized divisive topics and hateful figures, Talk TV gave a forum to bored, lonely, and regular people seeking 15 minutes of fame, even if the fame required embarrassment or confrontation. Trash TV was a precursor to reality TV and social media influencer culture, but with relatable or comforting hosts guiding you through the most bizarre trends and people in America, asking questions to satisfy your curious mind. Other kinds of media producers were also banking on the viewer's curious mind and looking for new ways to attract it. In the 80s, the readership of daily newspapers fell from 73% to 50%, and more Americans got their news from TV than ever before. Some newspapers fought back with editorial changes, while new papers like USA Today popped up in 1982. With color print, visual graphics, shorter articles, and more good news than bad, the paper cashed in on the glossy ambitions of Americans committed to viewing the Reagan administration and the world around them with rose-colored glasses. It would eventually become the third-ranked newspaper in the country. While print media was beginning to change, the industry itself was still powerful and lucrative compared to today. Reputable freelancers at Time Magazine, Wall Street Journal, and New York Times, for example, were getting up to $10 a word for their articles and enjoying lavish expense accounts. Magazines were especially popular among women, with a 1986 directory of women's media listing 331 women's periodicals in America alone, compared to 131 just 11 years before. Clearly, people were hungry for information. But how hungry? And what kind of information would satiate? In 1980, Ted Turner launched CNN, to tremendous skepticism because it promised to provide news 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Apart from a handful of established reporters like former NBC newsman Bernard Shaw, the company was largely employed by college students and graduates with little experience running TV production.
Unfolding before cable audiences across America, 24 hours a day, international news. National news, the events that shape all of our lives. Communicated with the immediacy of satellite technology. Cable News Network. CNN, based in Atlanta, with bureaus reporting from around the U.S. and around the world. With nationally known news professionals presenting the news that counts. The world's only 24-hour live television news network, Cable News Network.
When CNN launched on June 1st, 1980, it had just 1.7 million subscribers, but two of the biggest advertisers, Procter & Gamble and General Foods. It took took a while for the channel to find its footing.
Weekday mornings, CNN brings you special features from a variety of knowledgeable personalities.
Up, back, and hold, abdomen tight, release, tight.
Sure, the cooling system is cooled down before you remove the radiator cap.
A flower pattern for a fur coat. Brilliant sequence for all-out nighttime glamour.
Get quick, penetrating roots, new roots, out into the soil. You need to break up the shape of this pot.
Though the studio's expenses were twice what was projected and revenue was half of what was expected, the network covered a number of high-profile events in rapid succession. CNN attended both the Democratic and Republican national conventions, and its 24-hour format allowed it to cover each event from multiple angles that other news programs didn't have the time for. CNN also broke John Lennon's assassination and was the first news station to confirm in 1981 that Reagan had indeed been shot and was in critical condition. In just 2 years, there were over 13.9 million homes with CNN, and by the end of the 80s, CNN was in over 53.8 million homes. ABC, CBS, and NBC, or the Big Three, would come to launch their own late-night news shows and other programming to capitalize on the appetite for round-the-clock news. Stories like the 56-hour 1987 rescue of Midland, Texas infant Jessica McClure, or Baby Jessica, from a 22-foot well were covered from every angle imaginable, uniting Americans and making new mini-celebrities. Said Reagan of Baby Jessica, "Everybody in America became godmothers and godfathers of Jessica while this was going on." Horrible, horrible. My Reagan accent is horrible, but that's why you're subscribed to me, isn't it? During the last few minutes of her rescue saga, a whopping 3.1 million Americans were tuned into CNN and millions more to other channels.
There's clapping.
Worldwide donations, at least 700,000, including money from the Reagans, whose experience would net a TV movie and a meeting at the White House. Elaborated the New York Times, the Walt Disney Company sent a 5-foot-tall Winnie the Pooh, along with an invitation to visit Disneyland as their guest. The Federal Express box that brought the bear was signed by FedEx employees at every stop along the way. A well-wisher in Vienna sent a chocolate cake. Someone closer to home shipped Jessica a custom-made waterbed. A Shar-Pei puppy, which she named Shirley, was also a gift. She received enough clothing to last until she was 5. She was even invited to the Vatican for an audience with the Pope. The McClure family's fame and gifts would quickly turn their neighbors against them. Several rescuers and the McClures themselves got divorces, partly due to the strain from so much attention, and the overnight fame of Jessica's primary rescuer, Robert O'Donnell, was so overwhelming that it was attributed to his 1995 death by suicide. After the rescue, his phone rang non-stop. He made TV appearances, and he and other rescuers were torn apart by narrative infighting regarding the Jessica McClure movie. Because there was more news airtime, there was more conjecture and more fluff, as well as attention paid to a more diverse range of experiences and a new type of budding celebrity. Routine situations that became catastrophes, or life experiences that became ensnared into 24-hour news fodder, could give a once anonymous person valuable fame, potential money, or unfathomable misery. Also, more people's stories being profitable meant more capitalist interest. Increased media consolidation was set into motion in 1985 when both ABC and NBC were bought by Capital Cities Communication and General Electric, respectively. Newspapers and radio stations were similarly snapped up in media consolidation deals, making more media, often sustained with money from various ethically compromised corporations, even more focused on profit over ethics or truth. Newspapers of record like New York Times and Washington Post stood out because they were owned by families and not taken over by outsiders, giving them more editorial freedom. Though these papers and other companies were by no means radical, they were often liberally leaning and increasingly tolerant of non-traditional positions and people. Along with even more moderate media companies, it was in this skewed media landscape that conservative voices grumbled and sought out alternatives. In the 80s, the best way for a white conservative, especially in liberal strongholds, to hear ideas in language that were not the liberal mainstream media was by turning on AM AM radio. Many music stations moved to the higher quality FM radio, allowing AM talk to flourish with shock jocks like Howard Stern and political commentators. The openly racist, xenophobic, and homophobic commentator Rush Limbaugh launched his talk radio show in 1984. He said and did a bunch, but one of his biggest blunders was falsely claiming that HIV/AIDS did not impact heterosexuals. He landed syndication in 1988, the same year that he embarked on the Rush to Excellence tour, earning money and influence as a conservative commentator. An article described his enemies as black activists, gay activists, abortion rights activists, homeless activists, animal rights activists, militant vegetarians, environmentalists, artists with erotic tendencies, and above all, the Now Gang. Damn, that's about everybody I fuck with. Limbaugh's show was hosted on nearly 300 radio stations across the country, and more conservative talk show hosts would follow in influence. In 1989, future Fox News commentator Sean Hannity was fired from a UC Santa Barbara volunteer radio station because he called HIV/AIDS a gay virus and said a bunch of other homophobic stuff I won't repeat here. After being fired, he quickly publicized himself and landed new positions at conservative radio stations. While Nazis and Klan members lacked overall cultural currency and widespread support, their soft counterparts in media would eventually repackage and filter many of their ideas for a wider audience, much in the same way that radical left beliefs of the 60s were repackaged and filtered in the 70s and beyond. Folded into the diet of constant news, thrilling talk shows, and patriotic symbolism sprinkled on everything by the Reagan administration was propaganda. Hill Street Blues, Cagney and Lacey, 21 Jump Street, and many other police procedurals entertained as TV shows are meant to do, but also promoted the rosy view that cops have high crime clearance rates, that police brutality is adequately addressed, and that police are generally selfless heroes who can overcome their own biases and flaws in an hour-long program. Seeing the success of such shows, in 1988, TV writer Dick Wolf dreamt up a program he would call Law and Order, because he wanted something optimistic about the American criminal justice system. Reality TV wouldn't be far from this slew of police procedurals. In 1989, the newball cable channel Fox launched Cops. It primarily showed the arrest of Black and Latino people, as well as making light of mentally disturbed and unhoused people. It was immediately a hit for the network, garnering 8 million viewers an episode at its peak, and would air for 30 years. In 1990, the Hate Crime Statistics Act was signed into law after being successfully adopted by both chambers of Congress the year before. In the Senate, a whopping 92 voted yes, while only 4 voted no, including that recurring villain from my home state, Jesse B. motherfucking Helms. The act gave the green light to collecting and publishing data about race, religion, ethnicity, and sexual orientation-based hate crimes, which, as this series has demonstrated, was greatly needed. But notice how disability hate crimes weren't mentioned. By looking at the 1980s from points of view so often ignored in mainstream modern history retrospectives, Black people, Black women, the unhoused, Jews, the disabled, etc., the long-term links between ableism, conspiracy theories, anti-Semitism, hatred, and racism in social media age political discourse is apparent. Furthermore, it becomes clear that while mental health issues do not cause people to be racist, misogynistic, homophobic, violent, seriously, don't come in my comments claiming that's what I'm saying, neglecting the prevention and treatment of mental disorders exacerbates such behavior. This fell and still falls on both the government's lack of healthcare provisions for its taxpayers, as well as the cultural stigma of mental disorders. Ableism all around. Next, the media diets of many Americans, who should be and are free to choose the media they consume, shed a spotlight on new ideas and people, but also exposed and exploited the fears and hatred lurking beneath the Reagan myth of wellness and prosperity. It also greenlit 15 minutes of fame dreams for people who were mentally disturbed and or intensely hateful. It's not hard to see how reality TV, troll culture, and social media influencer culture would flourish in decades to come. Reagan declared it was morning again in America, while exacerbating ongoing problems and sweeping them under the rug. But these problems, as this series has shown, can't be solely laid at Reagan's feet. We've looked at the 80s from a lot of angles, but now it's time to tie everything together and escape from the cruel and annoying specter of Ronald Reagan. My ghostwriters are telling me that Reagan will still pop up in Lexual Does the 90s. Oh, god damn it! So how How would body, mind, media, and hate converge with larger global issues as well as Reagan-style conservatism in the 1988 elections? And what the hell was going on in the rest of the world from 1985 to 1989? Find out in the series finale of Lexual Does the 80s. If you're enjoying Lexual Does the 80s and the corresponding I Love the 80s, be sure to subscribe to Intellectual Media on Patreon. All it takes is $1 a month to help me produce 1 to 2 high-quality videos each month. Thanks so much for watching this video, and I hope you like and subscribe.